Okay. Yesterday, the 2nd of June 2017, Donald Trump, the American president, basically pulled out of the Paris Agreement for climate change. Now, the Paris Agreement for climate change is an attempt by almost 200 countries to work on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, is to set targets, realistic targets that could at least slow down the rate of climate change. Now, climate change is a very long process. It's something which takes decades or even centuries for someone to really see the effects. But I think because of the increased globalization, in fact, the increased industrialization which has been taking place across the developed world and now the developing world, there are fears that the continued use of fossil fuels will impact or will worsen the situation that we're already in. Now, why are we already in a situation? Okay, we are in a situation because as it stands, we are beginning to see adverse weather conditions. We're beginning to see extreme weather, and that includes cyclones, that includes droughts in sub-Saharan Africa. So the pulling out of Donald Trump is an indication that he does not want to be held accountable by the Paris Agreement, the targets that have been set, although those targets are not legally binding. So he could sign the treaty and still not abide by the guidelines which have been given. They are just guidelines. They are not legally binding. No one goes to jail for it. So it's something that even if the Americans were in the deal, they would still not be legally bound to follow those rules. So there's a precedence to this. In 2015, under President Obama, it was the first time that the Americans had agreed to be part of or to ratify the climate change agreement, because before that they had not really been on board. Okay, so for the first time in 2015, the biggest polluter in the world, which is the Americans, had agreed that they would take part. Now, alongside China, America was the biggest. So Obama had signed the treaty, but I don't know whether Donald Trump is trying to reverse everything Obama did, or he genuinely believes that the treaty or the agreement is not good for American business. But there are arguments to that, and it really doesn't affect his business, according as far as I can see, because it's not binding. So they don't really have to follow it. Or they just need to make a commitment. I think if the biggest polluter makes a commitment, it sends a message to the rest of the world that America is not only willing to lead militarily, but they're also willing to lead economically and to lead in terms of the environment and saving the planet. Okay, so Obama signed the agreement in 2015, but Trump is threatening to pull out. Now, 194 countries, almost 200 countries, agreed to the agreement or agreed to ratify the agreement. But there's a tug of war between globalization, which is what this is. It represents an unprecedented agreement of almost 200 countries, almost on the scale of the United Nations. And so it is something that was exciting for everyone. But we've seen in recent times with the Brexit and also with the election of Donald Trump and with what was happening in the French election, we had seen that there is an increase in nationalism or in right-wing politics. And so whether this is an issue between globalization and nationalism is something that we can also think about. Okay, so what is climate change anyway, and what is the main purpose of this agreement, the Paris Agreement? So the Paris Agreement's main purpose was for countries to make commitments in which they were going to reduce carbon emissions, mainly in the form of carbon dioxide being released due to the combustion, due to the burning of fossil fuels, especially coal, because most of the coal that we burn is used for power generation in power stations. But also burning diesel and petrol also releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But it also releases sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. Now, that causes the greenhouse effect, which is why they are called greenhouse gases. But the one that worries us most is the carbon dioxide, because that's produced from the burning of fossil fuels, and also mainly just the burning of fossil fuels. So that's what causes the release of carbon dioxide. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that from a scientific point of view is that carbon dioxide becomes part of the atmosphere. And when it becomes part of the atmosphere, it blocks the escaping of heat, because when light falls on the earth, it bounces off as infrared radiation or as heat. Okay, so that heat is trapped, and that causes the global temperatures, the average global temperatures, to rise. So this treaty was to try, or this agreement was to try and put that temperature increase to about 2 degrees Celsius or less, okay, per annum. Now, in order to do that, countries would have to reduce their carbon emissions, and maybe that would promote research and development and the production of products and services in renewable energy sources like solar energy, for example, or wind power, or tidal wave power, etc. And a lot of companies like Apple, like Tesla, are already doing a lot. Google, they are doing a lot in terms of generating their power not from fossil fuels but from solar, and they've got giant solar panels that they're using for that purpose. Okay, next thing is that due to weather changes. Now, I was going to talk about because some of these 194 countries that have agreed to the Paris Climate Change Agreement are African countries from Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if you look at the effects of climate change, such as cyclones, droughts, extreme weather, which causes hunger, and also extreme weather might bring about some tropical diseases. So there might be a rise in the number of diseases which are affecting people. And so because of that, African countries are directly affected by climate change, which means it is in the best interests of African countries to not only participate, but also they have to think about their economies. Because when you look at America and China, those two combined will probably produce more than half the pollution that's produced in the whole world. And so African countries, although they are producing carbon dioxide emissions, they are not as much, they are not producing as much as the Americans and the Chinese. And so in order for their economies to grow, they also need to pollute the environment. It will be very difficult for Africa to develop without polluting the environment, although it's not to the extent as the Americans and the Chinese, but so at the same time, it's in their best interest that the Americans are reducing and the Chinese are also reducing the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a tug of war for the Africans between economic development by burning fossil fuels and also making sure that they don't burn too much. But whatever they are burning is nothing or pales in significance when you compare it to the Americans and the Chinese. Okay, so what the decision by Donald Trump means for Africa, what that decision means is that the Americans or Donald Trump is willing to still compete with the Africans in terms of economic development by using fossil fuels, because the economy of the United States can still grow without using a lot of fossil fuels because they are no longer dependent on industrialization. Okay, they have already gone past the industrialization stage, and they even have more efficient ways of burning fossil fuels, and they also have a lot of companies. One of the biggest companies or employers in America are not even polluting the environment. Okay, because companies like Apple and Google, they have reduced the amount of emissions. They are powering, most of their machines are being powered by solar energy anyway. So what it means is that Donald Trump is affecting or is indirectly saying that he is still happy to compete economically with China and with the Africans, even though the American economy is already miles ahead of the African economies. The combined GDP of Africa is even less than the GDP of the United Kingdom alone, let alone France, let alone the EU, and let alone the Americans and the Chinese. Okay, so I think what Africa should be thinking about now is how to mitigate against the effects of climate change, extreme weather, and also drought. So prepare for the advent of drought by making sure that you have sufficient food for the population, and also ensure that people are safe from adverse weather conditions, from an increased occurrence of maybe tropical diseases. So this is what Africa should be doing, and that's what the Donald Trump announcement might mean for Africa. Okay, so what is your take on this? Do you think that the decision made by Donald Trump has no effect, there's no impact on Africa, or how much impact do you think it has? Let me know in the comment section, and we can have another discussion concerning this topic.